seems like most of my messages crisscross and run into each other because this book is one word. We're trying to pronounce it as it comes together. We've been working on the spiritual Sabbath. The Bible speaks of a spiritual Sabbath. The Sabbath is not literal. The Sabbath is an Old Testament shadow. Sabbath is an Old Testament shadow. Where'd I get that? Out of the Bible. Colossians, the 2nd chapter says, Colossians 2, back over there very quickly. I've had one guy say, well, the Sabbath was not a shadow. It was the very image. No, it's not. And Colossians says so. I had people say crazy things to me. One guy said to me that the tithe was spiritual and said it was nomos. And nomos is the Greek word law. How in the world can you give 10% of the law? Besides that, the Bible says in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, that Paul said, if I minister unto you spiritual things, I come preaching spiritual things, it's no great thing that you should minister unto me carnal things. And carnal is just the word fleshly. Nothing wrong with the word carnal if you don't make your spiritual things carnal. Carnal, sarkikos, S-A-R-K-I-K-O-S. Well, sarkikos comes from sarx, which means flesh. Now, when we eat food, that's fleshly. It's not spiritual. When we drive a car, that's to get to work. That's flesh. It's not spiritual. And what the Bible says here over in people open their mouths before they find out what the Bible says. You know that? Oral Roberts said he saw a 900-foot Jesus out by his prayer tower in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's just like some little old lady saying, I saw Jesus by my bed last night. He came into my bedroom and talked to me. I keep saying she was probably smoking something right before that, because Jesus himself said in Matthew the 24th chapter, these guys don't check what they're saying. Jesus said, if anyone says, lo here or there, or he's in the desert, Jesus said, go not forth, because the next time the world sees me, it'll be as the lightning shines from the east to the west. So if anyone says they're seeing Jesus, Jesus said, no, it'll be as the lightning shines from the east to the west. The next time I make an appearance, every eye shall see him. Great day in the morning. And look here in Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Now this really astounds me when this guy said, well, maybe the Sabbath is spiritual. Well, the Sabbath today is spiritual. Well, one in the Old Testament, the Bible says here, he's telling the Colossian Gentile church, verse 16, let no man therefore judge you in meat, that's Jewish meats, or Jewish drinks, or in respect of a holy day, or of a new moon, or of a Sabbath day, which are a shadow. I wonder what that says. Let me see. Or a Sabbath day, which is the shadow. All the Sabbath days are skia, and the very image. This is what Hebrews 10:1 says. The law having a shadow of good things to come. That's all the things they literally celebrate over, and not the very image. The very image icon, the very representative icon It's what it represents. This is the shadow over here, and this is the real over here. Now, we've been talking about this, and we've gotten into it by telling you that there is a shadow, and the real thing casts the image. Here's the real thing over here. And it looks like it's casting it backwards to the Old Testament, but it's not. When you go outside, you're the image and you cast the shadow. Well, you're here first, aren't you, as the image? When you're in the room here and you're not outside in the sun, you come first, and then when you go out there, you cast the shadow. How is it that we cast the shadow back here? And how come this is the shadow? That's because we were before the shadow in the mind of God before the foundation of the world. He has chosen us in Him before the foundation of the world. He has predestined us, prohorizo. This really amazes me. Prohorizo. That's the word predestinate. In the Greek text, it comes from pro. And horizo, pro means before, and horizo means to bound, but it means to bound inside the, that's a little diacritical mark, and it has a H sound, a breathing sound, horizo. And horizo, notice how this all fits together. The Latin's added an N to it, and it's our word horizon, or God has pre-horizoned us to come out of the darkness here, the shadow, and to come into the light of the kingdom of His dear Son, the kingdom of light. But this was all in the mind of God before the foundation of the world. He had already started casting the shadow beforehand because He's chosen us before the world began to be inside the light. And that has to do with the shadow is not the real thing. The real thing is you and I in the mind of God before the world began. Known unto God are all His works from the beginning of the world. So the real was here in the mind of God long before we existed. Now, we're seeing this, we're talking about the spiritual Sabbath. And we're talking about, boy, there's a lot to this. We're talking about Israel. Watch. Here's the shadow. This is Israel here. That ain't the way it's shaped. I could do better than that, but that'll be good enough. And here's Egypt. And here's the Mediterranean Sea. It's just like over here, like so. It's like, let me see here. Here's Israel. Here's the Mediterranean Sea in here, right here. Here's Egypt. There's Libya. This is what we call Turkey. They called it Asia Minor. Here's Greece, and there's Rome. Rome looks like a little boot right there, like so. There's Sicily. And Athens is right here. Paul's missionary journeys, he went on his journeys. His first journey came up here to Antioch, down to Cyprus, up here to Pisidia, or Pamphylia right in here also. And then he went up here to Galatia. He went to Antioch, then he went to Iconium, Lystra, that's where they stoned him, tried to kill him, and Derbe. And then he went back there and came back home. Then on his second journey, starting there in the end of the 15th chapter of Acts, he comes up here, comes up to Lystra about right there, picks up Timothy to be his permanent companion, and he drops Timothy off, at least his permanent friend, drops him off at Ephesus for him to be the pastor at Ephesus. And then Titus ends up pastoring over here at Crete, right here. And Timothy and Titus, they wrote their epistles, the epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, And they're called pastoral epistles because these two men, Titus and Timothy, were pastoring these churches, respective churches at Ephesus and Crete. Now, we're talking about the shadow and the very image. In the Old Testament, Israel and Egypt here, Egypt, see it right here. This area here. There's the Delta land. Here's and this is the Red Sea right here, where Moses crossed somewhere. He left Egypt, came over here, and probably crossed up here somewhere where the sea was narrow, but it didn't have to be narrow for God to deliver. And this right here is the Sinai Peninsula, like so. Let me get this pretty close to right. And all the time, when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, he begins his journey in Exodus, the 12th chapter. That's the last. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down to 10 plagues that come upon Egypt in order to soften the heart of Pharaoh to cause him to let the people go. But each time God would say, I will harden his heart, and he will not let the people go. And he kept hardening his heart until finally he brings the 10th plague upon Egypt to soften his heart. And he softens his heart, and he says, I will let them go, let go at the Passover. And that's the last plague that was brought upon Egypt, was the death of the firstborn. And they had to put the blood there in Exodus, the 12th chapter, had to put the blood upon the doorpost in order for the firstborn to be delivered. When the death angel came through the land, it was probably Michael. That's who we consider to be the death angel. And when he comes to the land, he kills all the firstborn, including those at the house of Pharaoh. Well, that softens Pharaoh's heart. And then God causes Pharaoh's heart to be softened, and they take off and they get to the Red Sea right here, somewhere in this neighborhood right here. And then God in that time hardens Pharaoh's heart again. So he says, let's go get them. They can't do this to us. If you notice, each time it was God hardening his heart. He did not harden his own heart. God, you know what I believe his heart was hardened about? His pride. You're not going to do that to me. Well, they take off across the Red Sea, and God is leading them. Well, they get over here across the Red Sea, and they head down south towards the mountain of God, Mount Sinai. And then when they leave Sinai, they start complaining as soon as they get over across the sea into this land of Sinai Peninsula. And the entire 40 years is going to be spent in this peninsula. Here's where Israel wandered for 40 years. But they go down here, they start complaining. Start complaining about everything, and that entire journey is a picture in the New Testament of believers and unbelievers in the church. And God is going to have to, it's actually a picture of the inner man, Christ. And this outer man, the inner man is Christ in you. And that inner man is going to believe throughout our journey in this life, which is equated with the time that Israel was in the wilderness. And what's going to have to happen, God is going to have to kill all of these complainers. He's going to have to kill all the murmuring, murmuring, all the complaints, and all of the griping. And he's going to have to bring those believers. Now we look at it like it's two different people, but it was two different people over here. It was actually two different people. It was those that did not believe God, and all they did was gripe all the time they were in the wilderness. And over here, the believer who complains, he's going to have to kill off all of his complaints, all of his murmuring, and the way it's going to happen is years of trial and persecution until, and this is what God did to Israel in the wilderness, they wandered for 40 years, and 4 is a very significant number in the Bible. 4, the Jews said any multiple of 10, 100, or 1,000 was a form of the original number. Those were forms of 1. 40 is a form of 4. And 400 is a form of 4. Israel was in Egypt 400 years. And they were in the wilderness 40 years. And you're going to find these 400s and 4s. And the 4 judgments of God were the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and the beast. The beast was Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. God says, I'm going to send the sword, your enemies against you. David said, deliver me from the wicked, which is thy sword in thy hand. There in Psalm 17. The famine, that's economy, a shortage of food. This is war here against the people of God. And pestilence is a disease of all kinds, and the disease that we have, God says, therefore will I make thee sick and smiting thee because of thy sin. And then the beast, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. God says, I will put Israel under these judgments until I cause them to begin to rest in all of the things that they're going through. As you get older, I'm at a place in my late 70s where I rest. I used to not rest. I never rested. I was constantly fighting my enemies and wanting to fight, wanting to defend myself when I was right. A guy wrote me a letter, an email that said, you mean you're not supposed to defend yourself? Well, you're supposed to go to a situation lawfully. If somebody's trying to break in your house, call the police. Don't get a gun out and start shooting at people. And he said, well, I think we're supposed to defend ourselves. The Bible said, as a lamb to slaughter, as a sheep before his shears is dumb, he opened not his mouth. Let's be more like Christ. If you go out there to defend yourself, watch out. It may not be defense. It may be your pride you're defending. Now, I'm trying to point out to you everything that Israel went over here. They complained, and God said, they won't enter into my rest. And he was speaking of the spiritual Sabbath, and he talks about that over there in Hebrews, the 3rd and the 4th chapter. I'm trying to really get this down for you, because we're going to look at the fighting and arguing that Israel did with God over here, and how we do the same thing over here, because we got more of the outer man when we come to believe than we do the inner man, which is Christ in you. We have oligos pistis. That's the word puny faith. Jesus kept saying to the apostles, they were a bunch of young kids when he called them to follow him. He kept saying, "O ye of oligos pistis," puny faith. Your faith has to grow. If it doesn't grow, you don't belong to God. He's going to cause it to grow, and as you wipe away that outer man. You're not going to do it. God's going to do it in you. He's going to get rid of contention and strife, pride and arrogance and self and just being proud and lifted up. It's going to take a lot of fire, a lot of trials, a lot of a lot of judgments of God. God had to put Israel through it in the Old Testament, and you're going to find this journey, most of what we're going to study, we're going to find that in the book of Numbers. Now let me just give you a little rundown here. Genesis 1 through 50 is from Adam until Joseph, when he's sold into Egypt. Joseph. And then you got, and this is somewhere in the neighborhood, you've got 400 years after that. This is in the neighborhood of 2,300 years, from Adam until they come out of the wilderness at the hand of Moses. It's about 1,700 years from Moses being born till Jesus' birth. You've got more years in the book of Genesis than you do the rest of the Old Testament put together. Now, then after Genesis, they go into bondage at the end of Genesis. When Joseph dies, a new Pharaoh rises up that didn't know Joseph. It didn't mean he didn't know about him, because Joseph had saved Egypt and the civilized world from starvation with his ideas on storing up grains when he was made second in command in Egypt. Now, then Moses leads the children out. He sends 10 plagues, and they start in the 4th chapter, and they carry on all the way through the 12th chapter. Well, each time God would send a plague, the people would, Moses would go and say, "Are you going to let my people go?" And they would say, and Pharaoh, God would harden his heart and say, "No, I'm not going to let them go." And each one of those plagues was about attacking the gods of Egypt. Look at the 12th chapter of Exodus. 12th chapter. And it'll tell you that's exactly what it was. The river turning to blood, that was the Nile River turning to blood, and the Nile River was one of their gods.